Have you ever paused while watching a game or a movie and wondered why the figure we call a skeleton almost always appears in the exact shape of a human? Fantasy worlds are filled with strange and exaggerated monsters. Some have wings, some grow horns, some swell to the size of a house. But the skeleton is different. It always has 2 arms and 2 legs, the same rib cage, the same proportions, almost identical to a living human body. Why is that? Why does the most iconic symbol of death choose not a more grotesque or monstrous form, but the familiar shape of ourselves? Once you begin with this question, you realize that the skeleton is not just an enemy meant to fall to a hero's sword for experience points. It is the result of centuries of accumulated human thought, a layered record of how humanity has understood death itself. From this point on, we will take a deep look at the skeleton's evolution, not as a pile of bones, but as a fully formed creature, through 10 fascinating facts hidden beneath its surface.
The first interesting fact is that the skeleton was not originally created to be a monster. If you closely examine records from ancient and medieval times, you will notice something important. When death became an everyday presence during plagues like the Black Death, people wanted a way to explain death visually. What emerged was not a savage beast or an imagined demon, but human bones. In artistic traditions such as memento mori, meaning remember that you must die, and the dance macabre, where skeletons dance hand in hand with the living, the skeletal figures are always anatomically human. The reason is simple, yet deeply philosophical. Skin color, facial expression, clothing, social status, all of these disappear in death. What remains is bone. Kings and beggars alike are reduced to the same structure. Because of this, the skeleton became the most direct and equal image of humanity itself. Its original form was not a creature meant to harm people, but a mirror reflecting the final essence of what it means to be human.
The second interesting fact is that the skeleton became one of the fastest and most powerful universal visual symbols in human history. After the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, books and illustrations began spreading rapidly. These images needed to communicate ideas even to people who could not read. The skeleton did exactly that. Without a single word, a drawing of bare bones conveyed the same message to everyone, children and elders, speakers of any language. This is death, and one day this will be me. At this stage, the skeleton was not a tool of horror, but a visual warning and a moral lesson, a reminder to live humbly. Even today, the skull symbol on poisonous substances exists because of this shared historical instinct.
The third interesting fact is that the image of the game skeleton was already complete far earlier than most people realize. In 1974, long before computer games became mainstream, the first edition of the tabletop RPG, Dungeons & Dragons, established the skeleton as the standard undead monster. A rusted sword, appearing in groups rather than alone, the first enemy faced by beginner adventurers. Even the idea that blunt weapons work better against bones was already there. This template carried over seamlessly into digital games in the 1980s. Do you remember the 1985 arcade game Gauntlet? Endless waves of skeletons poured across the screen, redefining them not as singular threats, but as overwhelming obstacles. As legendary RPGs like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy adopted this formula, the skeleton became globally fixed as the signal that a journey had truly begun.
The fourth interesting fact is that skeletons are almost always bound to darkness, night, underground spaces, and shadowed places. Scientifically speaking, bones do not melt in sunlight, but culturally, bones were meant to be hidden, buried beneath earth and stone. Spaces of death, such as catacombs and graveyards, were deliberately separated from daily life. This separation carried directly into modern fiction. That is why a skeleton standing in a bright field under the midday sun feels strange, even comical. But when bones rattle in a damp dungeon lit by flickering torches or beneath cold moonlight in a cemetery, the fear feels natural. The skeleton's terror is only half its body. The other half is the darkness it stands within. The fifth interesting fact is that the idea of a moving skeleton began not in novels, but on theater stages. In the 15th and 16th centuries, moral plays were performed in churches and town squares. Actors wore bodysuits painted with bones or covered themselves with skeletal props. They would approach living characters and say, "I am your future." These skeletons were not meant to make audiences scream. They were theatrical tools, turning the abstract idea of death into a speaking presence. From the very beginning, the skeleton was not born as a beast that bites and tears, but as a figure meant to communicate, explain, and confront humanity. The sixth interesting fact is that in the modern era, skeletons began to live like humans. In satirical prints from the 18th and 19th centuries, skeletons no longer simply stood as grim reapers. They wore clothes, they played cards, they drank, fought, and mocked the living. Artists used the dead to ridicule the foolishness of the living, and in doing so, skeletons gained personality. They thought, they used tools, they expressed emotion. This transformation laid the groundwork for skeletons to later become intelligent monster races in fantasy worlds, rather than mindless remains. The seventh interesting fact is that film transformed the skeleton into a warrior. In 1929, Disney's The Skeleton Dance made bones playful and humorous. But in 1963, Jason and the Argonauts reshaped them completely. Ray Harryhausen's stop-motion skeleton warriors, clashing swords with living actors, shocked audiences. Their jerky yet fluid movements felt unnatural yet terrifyingly alive. From this moment on, skeletons were no longer philosophical symbols observed from afar. They became physical enemies that swung blades and demanded to be defeated. The eighth interesting fact is that the moment a skeleton holds a weapon, its nature completely changes. An unarmed skeleton looks like a relic, a part of nature, almost something to respect. But once a rusted sword or shield enters its hand, our instincts shift instantly. Weapons represent intent. A skeleton that still grips a weapon suggests malice, obedience, or an unending will to fight. Game designers understand this perfectly. If you want players to attack without guilt, you give the enemy a weapon. An armed skeleton is no longer remains, it becomes a target. The ninth interesting fact is that skeletons are most frightening not alone, but in endless numbers. Zombies or vampires can terrify individually. Skeletons, however, rely on repetition. Break one apart and another rises behind a tombstone. A hand reaches up from the soil. Bones clatter from every direction. The true fear is exhaustion, the feeling that this will never end. The skeleton's greatest weapon is not its blade, but the psychological pressure of endlessness. The 10th interesting fact is that the skeleton is the only monster that never truly feels finished. When flesh and blood creatures fall, the battle ends, but a collapsed pile of bones feels temporary. Many games reinforce this by allowing skeletons to reassemble themselves. They have already crossed beyond death. Fighting a skeleton becomes less about victory and more about endurance, a test of how long you can withstand repetition without despair. So, after exploring these 10 facts, how do you see the skeleton now? It is not a disposable monster. It is a mirror, one that has reflected humanity's view of death across centuries. A teacher in the Middle Ages, a satirical performer in the modern era, and an eternal rival in today's games. And its story is not over. In recent games and webtoons, skeletons continue to evolve as parents, protectors, and even friends with human hearts. Perhaps through these bones, we are still asking the same question: what does it truly mean to be human? Next time, we will return with another monster's hidden history.